start here with the first page of the contract. And this piece is just the body of the contract, no addendums, nothing extra, just the 13 pages of the contract. So this first page of the contract is probably the most important thing to go over with a buyer and or a seller, especially if it's a dual agency situation. You want to definitely make sure you're going over this page of the contract. This page lets them know that they have a right to legal representation in relation to this contract. It's going to stipulate that who you represent as the one preparing the contract. So if you represent the buyer and the seller's agent prepared the contract, it's not going to change this top part here in item 1 where it says, as a real estate broker, I represent. It's not going to change just because you're giving the contract to your buyer if the seller's agent prepared it. So this number 1 item really deals with who prepared the contract. Moving into number 2 is the important part. You will not get any legal advice unless you have your own attorney. Neither I nor anyone, I got to move this panel. Neither I nor anyone from the title company can give you legal advice. So if you do not hire a lawyer, no one represents you in legal matters now or at the closing. Neither I nor the title company will represent you in those matters. So when you sit down at settlement and the title person is going over the closing docs, I've been there before where I've actually had someone say to them, well, in the contract it said, well, the title person has no idea what was in the contract. And well, now it's too late to talk about the contract anyway, because you're at closing. But this lets them know up front, right from the very beginning, the first thing they're going to sign related to purchasing a home or selling a home says you have the right to legal advice. This also explains that the contract is the most important part of the transaction. Buyer or seller, this document represents their rights, risks, and obligations, and signing it is a big step. So a lawyer will review the contract, help you understand the contract, and negotiate its terms. Please be very careful in noting that it doesn't say, hey, I'm your realtor. I'm going to review the contract with you. I'm going to help you understand it, and I'm going to negotiate its terms. That's a boundary we tend to overstep as realtors and wanting to be very helpful to our clients. That crosses the line of practicing law, very clearly stated on the very first page. This also lets them know that the contract becomes final and binding unless the lawyer cancels it within the following 3 business days. So notice it says the lawyer cancels it. That's also an important piece, because if you want to be written out of a contract during the attorney review period, well, attorney would write them out of the contract. So here it says the attorney can release you for any reason whatsoever during this 3-day attorney review period.
Julie, can I ask a question?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so I thought one of the things that people hire a realtor for is we tell them that we're going to negotiate the best terms for them, the most favorable terms. That's
You're negotiating that before they get to the contract, aren't you?
Oh, so
once you get to the contract, remember Ben Dash, Greg Voorhees, every attorney we've ever had on here, when we've asked the question, where do we as realtors cross the line in practicing law? All of them will say to you, at the point of contract, your job is done.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So this is the first page of the contract, which says to them, hey, you're in contract. So from this point forward, I'm going to negotiate the terms of the contract for you as the attorney, not me as the agent. The attorney is going to negotiate the terms of the contract, because there are things in the contract that speak really well to protecting the buyer and things in the contract that speak really well to protecting the seller. So depending on who you represent and that attorney represents, well, they might want to strike some of those things. So you can't strike those things because, well, you're not the attorney. And that's what part of this negotiation period during the attorney review process is about. So in number 5, it also lets them know that the lawyer says another important service of the lawyer is to order a survey, title report, and other important reports in North Jersey. So north of Princeton, the attorney does all of that. Here, our title companies do that, but the attorney is going to review all of that because the survey and the title report are prepared in legalese, not normal layman's ease. So it's hard for us to read a title report because we don't understand all the language that is in it. So this is where you have the opportunity to say again to your buyer and even the seller, the attorney is going to review the survey and the title report. Now, it doesn't mean you don't look at it, but it does mean the responsibility for finding all those nitty gritty things in there is on the attorney, not on you. If they have the seller, the lawyer will prepare the documents needed to close title, and the lawyer will be there to represent them at closing. Anybody ever have the attorney for your client not show up at closing and you're sitting there with your client? That's probably a bad attorney. I'm just going to throw that out there. Most attorneys will show up to closing. If you have the seller, generally the attorney is the only one that comes to closing anymore. And sometimes they're not even there. No one has to be there on the sell side anymore because they turn the paperwork in ahead of time. So number 6, a buyer without a lawyer runs special risk. Only a lawyer can advise a buyer about what to do if problems arise concerning the purchase of this property. The problems may be about the seller's title, the size and shape of the property, or matters that may affect the value of the property. Say there's an easement, a sewer line easement they don't know about that runs through the property. Maybe the seller didn't have a survey to provide. So once the buyer gets the survey, it's like, oh, well, what does that mean for me? Or maybe there's this big wide open space of land behind the property and it's an estate sale. So the people selling the property, they never lived there. They were just family. The buyer gets the survey. This big piece of land has all these weird markings on it, but okay, it's still within the boundaries of my land. Awesome. I have all this land. Well, that land might be specially marked as wetlands. That land may be protected by the Pinelands Commission. That means you can't build on it. That means you can't put a garage on it. It means you can't put a deck on it. It means you can't put a shed on it. It means you can't do anything with it. But if they don't have an attorney to review that and make sure that that's the case and go over that with them, they may be thinking they can do something with all that land and they cannot. So it's important, 1, that they have a survey, but 2, that they have someone to properly review that survey with them. The title company will generally point things out like there's an encroachment or an easement, like, hey, by the way, the neighbor's driveway is on this property. Are you guys aware of that? If you have a good title company, they'll make sure you're aware of that. But it is the attorney that's going to take care of all of that with them. So number 7 is the beautiful part. Whether you retain a lawyer is up to you. It is your decision. Purpose of this notice is to make sure that you have the information needed to make your decision. So nowadays we have clients flying through and signing everything ahead of time, just sign, and woo, they got the house, but they're not paying attention to what they sign. If they have an attorney that's going to represent them, you can feel much better about that. But if they don't have an attorney, you need to make sure you're reading this page to them. And this page starts with your buyer or your seller at your first consultation. First time you meet with a buyer, first time you meet with a seller, you need to explain to them the importance of having an attorney represent them, a real estate attorney represent them. Otherwise, you'll be at settlement for 5 hours and the attorney will read every line of the mortgage package. So it's important that the attorney becomes kind of like your wingman. They're essential in you being proficient at doing your job. They are also a huge layer of protection for your client. That's why it's the first page of the contract. New Jersey is one of the only states that allows for this attorney review period after everyone has signed the contract. Most states, once you sign the contract, you are in like Flynn, no more review. So very important we point this out to people, especially if they have, man, if mom or dad live in Pennsylvania or mom and dad live in New York, completely different process. And they will be giving your client information that is counter to what the process looks like here in New Jersey. So get in front of it. That's the main thing I can tell you, get in front of all things. Anybody have any questions about that part?
Julie, I'm sorry I came in a couple of minutes late. Could you go to the top of the document, please, so I could, okay.
This is the first page of the contract. So remember, you can pull this contract down and you should, everyone should grab this contract and read it, because even though you're not supposed to technically explain it, and you should know what's in it. You should know what section 16 covers. You should know what section 9 covers. You should know where the mortgage amounts are put in. So it's very important that you read through the body of the contract and know the body of the contract. That's the first page. Then we actually get into the meat of the contract, which begins with a table of contents, which I always find funny because that is one thing I don't know in the contract. I don't know that I've ever really paid attention to the table of contents, but it does give them a rundown of quickly where to find different pieces in the contract that will affect them and their transaction. You can ignore that there's names in here. I had to dump this into a transaction that's actually a rental. So these names do not apply, but you can see how they fill in. I don't have to go in and manually put this information in because in DocuSign, everybody in here using DocuSign or .loop? Anybody not using DocuSign or .loop? Okay. If you're using DocuSign or .loop, the front page is going to ask you for information. You can list the seller's names in there, the buyer's names in there, the agent's names in there, information about the transaction, the sale price, the closing date. Those things are going to auto-populate for you when you put them in. They're going to auto-populate on every document, which is super helpful. That way you're not having to go back through here and rewrite everything. So this form we're looking at is auto-populated based on information I put on the front page, the details page of this transaction in DocuSign. So you're going to have the buyer's information, and notice I have an initial here. If that's what their name looks like on their driver's license, that's what you want their name to look like on the contract. It'll make it easier in title, especially with this name. The name Jason Michael is going to flag in title all over the place because it's two common names, right? Then you have the seller's information. Then you're going to have the property information. So the property information will auto-populate because when you're at this point in DocuSign, you've put that information in. You've listed the address for the property, especially if you have the seller because you completed the listing agreement. So you had to put the address in there. What it's not necessarily going to pull over for you is starting down here on line 38. This is where you really kind of have to start putting stuff in on your own. They have the address, the city, state, and zip code. You're confirming it. But we need to put in here shown on the municipal tax map of and the county. So this is going to be the township or the city. So in this case, it would say Cherry Hill here. And then the county is Camden. The block and lot number information you are able to get from the listing. You can get it off the public records information in the listing. It should be on the front page of the listing. This qualifier here showed up October of last year. It only applies in condominium situations. Used to be in part of the numbers, but now it's broken out. And it'll actually say in the listing the letter C in front of a number. And it's usually the condominium's address number. But you put that qualifier in only if it's a condominium property. Line 38 and line 40 are key for title. So everything you've done up to this point in putting in information, title is using exactly what you put in here in order to pull title. That's why it's important. The loan officer is also looking at this information carefully because in some areas, I'm going to pull up in Oakland, Haddon Township. There's part of Oakland that is technically Haddon Township. Westmont, Haddon Township. Westmont is in Haddon Township. If you don't put the right post office information in this section, then it becomes a problem for the lender and title. So it's pretty important to have this information correct up front, even though it just seems basic, it's still important for the contract. Okay, total purchase price. Please check this when you represent either side and the other side prepared the contract. You're going to want to have in writing what the agreed upon sale price is, what the purchase price is, but make sure they put the right value in there. This can get a little mixed up when, say the property's been under contract before and it fell apart for some reason, and now you, the seller's agent, you're writing a new contract. Well, if you didn't change the information on the front page and the details page and it was already populated in there, when you go in here and you manually put the number in, it might not save that number because the details page has a different number. So double check this before you send it and double check it before you send it to your clients to sign. We also want to make sure that the agent's being honest. So total purchase price, initial deposit. Again, that's something else that's been negotiated up front with the offer. In some cases, they may be making 2 deposits. We generally only see this in homes, I would say, at 500,000 or more, or sometimes cash transactions. Generally, they'll do an initial deposit at the time the contract is signed, or the time frame we'll see on the next page. But a second deposit may be made 10 days later. Maybe it's made after they have the home inspection. So there may be 2 deposits, but generally in our market, we're only seeing 1. The mortgage amount is the mortgage amount. If it's cash, you're not going to have anything here. This mortgage amount should match your buyer or the buyer's pre-qualification or pre-approval letter from the lender based on the sale price of the property. Now, say the sale price of the property is $350,000 and the pre-approval letter you have is for $410,000. Well, the number's not going to match, but you're going to be able to look at the pre-approval letter and see how much they're putting down towards their loan, and that's how you're going to get that mortgage number. So another key piece here with number 47, line 47 where the mortgage is line 47 needs to match, I went too far, line 57 here where it says principal amount of mortgage. This box here on line 75 should be the same thing as you're inputting here on line 47. So double check those 2 numbers. Balance of the purchase price is not what the buyer is bringing to closing. It is this number minus the deposit and the mortgage. It's that difference. So to double check yourself, these numbers add up, line 45 through 48, 48 add up to match line 44. Any questions about that? Okay. Manner of payment. So this first part deals with the deposit. The deposit is not due at the moment the contract is signed, mostly because, well, your buyer has to go to the bank and get the check, right? Used to be you sat down with the buyer, they met you at the office like a day or the next night after you came to agreement. Might be 2 days after you come to agreement. So they've had time to go get the deposit. Now they're signing like within hours of receiving the contract because they're doing it electronically. So the deposit is not due at the time of signing. The deposit can be due any day that is put into this spot. However, if this spot is left blank, then it's within 5 business days after the fully signed contract has been delivered to both the buyer and the seller. This is becoming more and more common, and it's a couple of reasons. One, we need to allow for the attorney review period. Once you, as the seller's agent or whoever's holding the check, receive the check, it has to be put into the escrow account at the brokerage, the trust account, the attorney's office, or the escrow account at the title company. So that money has to be deposited, essentially. When that happens, if the contract is canceled during your attorney review, well, then you got all these steps to go through to get your buyer the money back. So this if left blank part is what I'm seeing most of the time. It also works really well for, say the buyer's moving here from Idaho and their bank is there, or maybe they bank online, or maybe they bank at Chase Bank and they can't find a Chase Bank nearby. Well, I mean, one did just open in Marlton, but say they couldn't find a Chase Bank anywhere. Well, they have to be able to get the check. So we have to allow a little bit of flexibility there so the buyer can get the deposit check. Now, the deposit check can be held by any of these parties here that are listed or other. I don't know who other would be. Traditionally, it was the listing broker that held the check. So if it's the listing broker that holds the check, you as the listing agent are responsible for getting the check ahead of settlement time and bringing it with you to settlement. Very easy to forget to do that in the billions of other things you're doing. So if the buyer's attorney, they don't generally like to hold the check, or the buyer's title company, always happy to hold the buyer's check, then you don't have to remember to bring it. It's on somebody else to remember to bring it. Title company is becoming more and more the norm, and it just makes sense. The title company is kind of like a third party. They don't represent the seller. They don't represent the buyer. I mean, they're working for the buyer, but not in the way that you are. So having it held at the title company makes it easy for many reasons. The title company already has a check. No one has to remember to bring it. No one has to remember where it is. Just kind of keeps it simple. So any of these can be selected. I note when I send an offer, when I have the buyer's agent, when I have the buyer, I note that we prefer the earnest money deposit to be held at the buyer's title company. If I have the seller, I let the buyer's agent know I want the check held at the title company. Who will their title company be?
Can I ask a question?
You sure can.
If this defaults, who gets the and the deposit money is owed to the seller because the buyer defaulted, how does the check get from title to the seller?
Well, kind of tricky because in this market, the seller's given the money back because the seller has to prove loss. So say the
Like
buyer
if they
freaks out and
didn't
decides
show,
they're not buying the property because they just don't like it anymore and they don't present a home inspection request. They don't present any requests. They just want out of the contract. Well,
say
that
they
buyer,
didn't
that
show up
seller
at
probably
settlement.
has 8 other people they can go back to sell the property to. So they really have no loss. They have no financial loss. But what happens when the contract is, we call it a withdrawal and release. When that withdrawal and release is written up, both parties have to sign that they're in agreement with the seller keeping all the money, the buyer getting all the money back, or it being split. If there is any dispute about that, attorneys have to be involved and nobody wins. It's going to end up getting split down the middle and they're both going to give a third or more to their attorney and everybody's going to walk away with a lot less. And you as the agent are stepped out. You have nothing to do with it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but there's a legal process that happens with it. But in the market, I can't say never. Only one time have I had the buyer want the money back and the seller say no way. And the reason for that was the seller agreed to everything the buyer asked for in their request for repair, plus the seller offered to do more. And the more that they offered to do was replace 14 windows in the house that the buyer didn't even ask for. And
Wow.
the buyer was like, forget it. I still don't want this house. And the seller
Yeah.
was like, well, then I'm not giving you your money back.
Mhm.
And the deposit was like $2,000 and they both ended up walking away with $450.
Okay.
And
My
it took 9 weeks for that to be resolved.
I had the seller, the buyer on the other side never showed up and the money is just sitting there and title won't release the funds and the attorney wrote a letter, the buyer won't sign it. So it's just sitting.
No, it's going to just sit there. That's ridiculous.
It's
Why
stupid.
won't the buyer sign?
Right. He won't sign. He won't return any phone calls or emails from his realtor on the other side. Like I said, I had the seller.
Oh, that poor realtor.
Yep. Yeah.
Oh, that's kind of a mess.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So here we're noting line 56. If there's an additional deposit, that's that second deposit. What date is that due? And you'll see here that this says if it's left blank, it's within 10 calendar days after the fully signed contract has been delivered. So this would likely not be, it might be after they have the home inspection, but it's just 5 days different from here. Usually I'll see a date written in here and that date is predicated on the home inspection period. Or if it's a $20,000 deposit, or I might have just had one that was 40, they split 20 here and 20 here, and they did this 20 before the home inspection. So we did have dates in that case. Escrow, who's holding it? This paragraph gives the buyer and the seller the knowledge and the information about where the escrow is held. It also lets the buyer know, because a lot of times I get questions from the buyer with like, well, is the seller getting this check? Like I'm giving the seller this money. Are you giving the seller this money? No, the seller never gets that money. Like it just becomes a credit on paperwork. It's kind of hard for some buyers to wrap their head around, and even sellers where they're like, well, where's the deposit? I didn't get the deposit. Well, line 60 starts to explain that for them, that where the deposit monies are held. Also
Julie?
talks about being, sorry, you had a question?
Yeah, I had a question. In today's market, in our area, what is typical for the deposit amounts, at the various stages? What's usually?
I'm still only seeing one, unless it's a really high valued property. If it's 800,000 plus, then sometimes we're seeing 2. It depends on the sale price of the property. Tradition is, and Tammy, I saw you pop on, so you can correct me here if you see something different. Traditionally, I'm seeing between 1% of the sale price to 3% of the sale price is what people are putting down for deposit. Now, in this market, I'm seeing more in some cases. So it becomes a negotiable point. I will say the long and short of the deposit is it's, I hear several attorneys refer to it this way. It is false hope. Because the seller feels like, well, I get to keep that money. Like if they change their mind, I get to keep that money. Not really. And it can be $1. It can be nothing if everybody agrees they don't need one. It could be whatever it is.
Who's the check written out?
Oh, go ahead.
Who's the check written out to? Title or
The check is written out to, I'm gonna scroll back up real quick.
Sorry.
Whoever's name is here on line 61
Mhm.
is who the check is made out to. Right here on line 61. And you will see with most brokerages, it needs to be a bank certified check, a cashier's check. There are a few brokerages that will take a personal check. The reason they don't want the personal check is because it takes time for that to go through the deposit, turn it around, find out that it was a bad check. So that's why everybody wants the bank certified check.
Okay. Who is it usually written out to?
Again, whoever, if up here in line 32, it's listed, if it's marked listing broker, then the listing brokerage name is put here.
Okay, got
If you
it.
represent the buyer and your brokerage is going to hold it. So whoever is picked here for the initial deposit on line 52 to hold the check, that company's name is listed out here in line 61. That entity is listed here. So again, it could be Keller Williams, it could be Surety Title, whichever title company. It could be the attorney, whatever is agreed upon, that company's name is written here.
Thank you.
Sure. If the buyer is getting a mortgage, there are contingencies that go with obtaining the mortgage. You want to note in here, again, importantly on line 75, this principal amount may change, especially if they're an FHA buyer. You're going to notice, you won't notice, but when they get their loan estimate, that number is not going to match exactly what's in this box. It's going to be off a few $100s. The important piece here is what type of mortgage are they getting? Because if you have a buyer that comes in and you guys negotiate everything and there's 10 offers and you represent the seller and you pick a buyer that's getting a conventional mortgage, and then they turn around and decide they're going to get a VA mortgage, that changes the terms of the contract because they are getting a different type of mortgage. And the seller may not have picked them if they were getting a VA mortgage. The other piece you do want to pay attention to that is kind of important here with this number, now that I'm thinking about it. If the offer says they're going to put 20% down and be conventional and they turn it around to 10% down FHA, well, that changes everything on line 75. That has to be renegotiated. That has to be made known up front. It affects the appraisal, and the appraiser is looking at this document when he does the appraisal. So what is put in line 75 has to match what's in the offer, and that needs to stay the same. That said, if they're an FHA buyer and all of a sudden they realize they can go conventional, that's great. Good for them. They're getting a what can be viewed as a more secure type of loan. If that changes, though, you would still need an addendum, and everybody needs to be made aware. So this line 75 should match. And here, if it's a 30-year mortgage with 30-year payment schedule, or 15 and 15 or 10 and 10, that needs to be listed here appropriately as well to match the pre-approval or the pre-qualification letter you're given. If it's cash, none of this applies. Another place, if it's cash, you don't need a mortgage commitment. Now, this mortgage commitment, if you leave this blank, it's due within 30 days after the attorney review period is completed. If you have a 30-day turnaround time from contracts being signed to going to closing, that won't work because your mortgage commitment will come after closing. Or I've seen it where the agent wrote it up and I'm like, the mortgage commitment's going to be due the day before settlement. Like, is that good? So try to put the mortgage commitment date when you're filling this out 7 to 10 days before closing. Now, if you have a long period of time, like you have 90 days, you can leave it at the 30 days or talk to the attorney or talk to the lender and say, how's 45 days? This piece here is kind of difficult with the lenders because they're being committed to something that they don't have any part or say in. So they see this date and they do their best to meet it. So again, important information about the mortgage in this section here.
Hey, Julie.
Uh-huh.
Did you, on that commitment letter, I know one thing that I'm learning in the atmosphere we're in is make sure you're communicating with your co-oping agent. So if you need an extension where you don't get anything, doesn't cancel, because people are being petty and we know buyers come a dime a dozen in this state. So you don't want anything that's going to cause your client to default when it's not their fault. Because some of these mortgage companies are so overwhelmed, they're either forgetting or needing an extra day or sometime week to do what they need to do in the time frames.
And it really is not, you're right, Tammy, it has nothing to do with the buyer. The mortgage lenders and the underwriters are, I don't even know how they're doing it. I don't know how they're still alive.
Yep.
Because they've been non-stop since, I would say, May of last year. They haven't
Yep.
been able to breathe.
Exactly.
So this is what I have when I go to contract and I see the mortgage commitment date. I give myself a note on my calendar 5 business days ahead of when the mortgage commitment is due as a little tick reminder to reach out to the lender, whether I have the buyer or the seller, and say, hey, the mortgage commitment is next week. How are we looking for that? So I'm asking the question ahead of time. That way we're in conversation. It's better to be ahead of it, like try to stay ahead of all those pieces. Be ahead and ask the question. Yes, you're probably bothering them. Yes, they don't want to hear from you, but you're staving off any issue of last minute, oh my gosh, the commitment's due today. We're not going to make it today. I did have one, I have a settlement this afternoon that the day the mortgage commitment was due, the lender, again, I don't know how they all didn't just like go play in traffic. Their system crashed. Like they couldn't issue commitments. They couldn't issue CDs. It was a terrible day. And it was the day our mortgage commitment was due. So the lender sends a quick email to everybody. And the seller's agent was like, hey, we're not worried about it. You get it to us whenever you get it to us. Take us off your list. We're not worried, which was awesome. But not everybody's playing that way. So stay ahead of it. Give yourself a reminder to ask. Ask 5 days out. If they don't answer you, ask 3 days out, then 2, then the day before, then the day of. Keep on it if you don't have it. It's okay to be a nudge. They'll get used to it. Balance of the purchase price. This is when we're putting our closing date in here. And this is the date that everything else in the contract is driven off of. This date can be changed. It can only be changed through an addendum. But this is also a date that everybody's agreed to. This has been agreed to with the offer and in the terms of negotiating that offer. So make sure this date matches the date that was with the offer that everybody agreed on. Sufficient assets. That's kind of a no-brainer, but it's still kind of important. Really in today's market, if the buyer has put in commentary that they're willing to pay X number of dollars over the appraised value if the house doesn't appraise, you need to be sure that they have that X number of dollars and that they have the money for the survey and that they have the money for the appraisal and that they have the money for the home inspection and that they have the money for their 3.5, 5 or 10 or 20, whatever percent down, and that they have the money for the closing cost. So when you're talking about all of these things with the buyer, before you go to make the offer, it's really smart to have a call with the lender so everybody doesn't put themselves in a bad situation of defaulting here because somebody doesn't have sufficient assets. That would actually make the buyer in breach of contract. So make sure up front they have the assets. As the seller's agent, when you see all these crazy things coming in, this is important for you as well. Your sellers are really excited about an offer that's $45,000 over asking, and you know it's not going to appraise at a penny over asking. You want to call that lender and say, do they have the assets? Do they have an extra $45,000 on top of all these other pieces? That lender should know. If it's a lender you've never heard of, maybe call them more than once and ask the same question. If it's a lender you're familiar with, they'll expect you're giving them the call. But we don't want to set anybody up in a position of they're so excited about the house and they make some crazy offer that they just can't back up. So it's important to make sure, just be a little bit diligent there, making sure they have the assets because they're saying they do. Accurate disclosure of the selling price. Yes, we're making sure that the contract reflects that price. Paragraph 6, items included in the sale. This should match the MLS, but it should also match what's been negotiated. If the MLS says the refrigerator in the kitchen is not included and neither is the washer dryer, but you negotiated for those pieces and you put it in your offer and the sellers come back and they accept your offer, but the agent writes it up and you don't see the washer dryer or the refrigerator in here, well, you need to have that conversation because they may have it listed down here and excluded when that wasn't your offer. Your offer was to include it. And honestly, anytime you see in the MLS that a seller says they want to take their refrigerator or they want to keep the washer dryer, it's still negotiable. It still doesn't hurt to ask, especially in today's climate where we're doing so much over asking. Certainly, go ahead, ask that question. It's okay. Things that are automatically included are listed here though. So there are some things that the contract says the seller's going to leave. Plants, fences, gas and electric fixtures, which means the stove and oven, hot water heater. I've never had anybody take a hot water heater, but it could happen. Flooring, never had anybody rip up the floor, but could happen, right? Screens for windows, storm sashes, shades and blinds. And you'll almost always see somebody writes in blinds. Well, they're already written here. Awnings, radiator covers, heating apparatus, sump pumps. Those things are automatically written in here, but there's no shed automatically written in here, right? There's no refrigerator automatically written in here or microwave. I mean, you could take it. So those kinds of things that you don't see written in here, if you know your client wants it, write it in just to be certain. Things you don't want to write in here that the lender doesn't want to see would be pool table, couch, dining room table, anything that is personal property. Things that you may also want to include that you may not think to include. Say the bathroom has a mirror that's like a picture mirror, like it's like a frame and it's just hung on the wall. You might want to put that in here because that's something that it functions like a picture. They could take it away. It's called chattel property. Make sure those things are clearly defined as what's staying and what's leaving. Excluded, if you have a seller that wants to keep the chandelier in the dining room and take it with them, you need to write in here very clearly what's going to happen with that chandelier. Is it just, they're just going to leave a box in the ceiling? Make sure you know that it's being taken. And there are times that this will change. There may be conversation after the home inspection where it changes. I had one a couple of years ago where the sellers were leaving all the ceiling fans and light fixtures, but as they were packing up, they realized their little boy was attached to this adorable ceiling fan in his bedroom, and they're packing up his closet, and he keeps asking his dad about his light. And the dad was like, well, we're not taking the light. Full meltdown, very upset not taking the light. It matched his bedding. So we just had a conversation with the buyers, and they were like, oh no, let him have it, that's fine. So we gave them a credit of $150 and they picked out their own ceiling fan. So again, this can change, but it was an addendum to make it change. But if your sellers want to take something, make sure it's noted. If your buyers want something left, make sure it's noted and agreed upon.
Did you ever have your sellers run off with the plantings, the shrubs?
Yep. I actually have a listing right now that has 18 fig trees and 6 of them are leaving.
Uh-huh.
We
Okay.
had to walk the property and mark which 6 are leaving. But yes, people, sometimes people, I don't understand that, but people are attached to their shrubs and sheds. I have gone to closing and the shed has been driving down the street. That's a problem. Bring the shed back. Dates and times. Oh, another thing you might want to note here, if you're leaving the refrigerator and all these pieces in the washer dryer, make sure that the listing has a picture of it. And if it doesn't, make sure you take a picture of it, because sellers have been known to swap out refrigerators, washers, and dryers. So your buyers aren't expecting something different than what they saw at the walkthrough when they saw the property or at the home inspection. We want to make sure the same thing is there when they close. Dates and times for performance. This is something that in North Jersey will be stricken, and there will be no time is of the essence in a contract. It just means things happen. In this part of the country, we follow very clearly to the dates and times for performance. Again, things can be extended. Certificate of occupancy and zoning compliance. This number here.
Julie, where time is of the essence, and then you need to change the, if it's not of the essence and you change the date, you don't have to put an addendum. But if you're operating under time is of the essence, do you need addendums every time you change the dates?
Well, if you have to extend for a mortgage commitment, yes. If you have to extend settlement, yes. Anytime a date is changed, then you have to have an addendum.
But not when you're dealing under North Jersey terms.
Well,
where,
we're not dealing under North Jersey, so we're not going to worry about it.
well, okay, but sometimes they have an
If you
attorney.
have a buyer or a seller that has a North Jersey attorney, I'm going to let you know right now, they need, your client needs an attorney.
Okay.
That's the long and short of it. They need an attorney.
Okay.
Certificate, and I'm kind of trying to hurry us up because I only have a half an hour before I have to cut us off. Certificate of occupancy and zoning compliance. You'll generally see a number in here and it'll be based on the area. So if it's Cherry Hill, somebody's probably putting 250 in that spot. A lot of times it'll be left blank with 1.5% of the purchase price. This was not in the contract before. This was newly added in October of last year. So make sure you're paying attention to that if you have the seller, because you could be committing your seller to paying a lot of money for something that comes up during the CO. Now, in today's market, I am seeing buyers offer to cover the CO. And if that's the case, then this will be marked as an NA because this relates to the seller and the amount the seller is willing to pay out of pocket. Again, it's still negotiable. If the seller writes $500 in here and they end up with $700 worth of something that has to be fixed, the seller can go back to the buyer and say, hey, will you pony up the other $250? Most of the time, the seller is just going to take care of it because they're either going to take care of it now or they're going to take care of it later. So this does not include, this is important because I've had a lot of sellers miss this, line 148. This number, this percentage has nothing to do with someone having to procure smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, the fire extinguisher, or indoor sprinklers working. That's just costs they need to do that they should already have operational. So this number here has nothing to do with line 148 and 149. Municipal assessments, this can get tricky. If the seller has flipped the property and they mark that they have not been notified of any such municipal assessments, I mean, they may not have been notified, but they flipped the property and they pulled permits or they put an addition on. The township knows, and the township's going to raise the taxes. There's no lien on the property, but it should be a conversation. This is really if there's a lien on the property and it's free and clear, but the municipality knows that you've improved the property. So there could be additional taxes that come against the property down the line for the buyer. Quality and insurability of title. The seller has to give clear title at closing. You can't close without clear title. And the seller is guaranteeing that with the sale of the property that they're able to clear title. They don't know of anything that's holding them up. Things that can hold up a seller from having clear title if they're in a bankruptcy. They may not be able to sell the property if the property is tied to the bankruptcy. They may not be able to, depending on what they owe on their mortgage and things they have to pay, they may not have enough clear balance in there. They may not have enough equity. But when they sign this contract, by this section here, they're saying they do. So if you are the seller's agent and you talk to your seller about how much they owe on the property, if it seems relatively close to what the property is selling for, you need to have a conversation with them about what they really owe on the property. If you find out that a seller owes backed child support, which will show up in title, that's a different conversation, but it's still a conversation that should be had because that has to be cleared before they can close on the property. Aloha, what'd you have?
I'm sorry, I was just saying property taxes, if they owed property taxes.
Yes. Yep, they could owe property taxes, or they could owe, if the house has been vacant and they haven't been paying, that each municipality has a fee for vacant properties. If they haven't been paying those fees for vacant properties, that adds up really quick, especially in Cherry Hill. That adds up super quick. Those things have to be paid because then it becomes a lien for the buyer. It becomes a lien for whoever takes over the property. And that's what the seller is saying here. We won't let that happen. We can move on with the property. We're going to clear title. They're also,
Julie, I never heard of that thing.
okay, separate conversation. Well, we can talk about that offline. Sorry. Yes, all municipalities have a vacant property fee. The vacant properties have to be registered. So title, we're saying that the title of property is good and the buyer will be able to get title insurance. We're also stating in here what type of property it is. Is it multifamily? Is it single family? Is it a condo? So, I mean, they should know. I've not really had this section mismarked, but it's blank so you can fill it in. And again, title will look at this and they'll check against this as well. So hopefully the seller is able to provide clear title. If they're not able to provide clear title, then starting at line 148, we have a conversation about reducing the purchase price. The buyer can void the contract, but then the monies have to be given back to the buyer that they already spent. So it is good to have a conversation with your seller ahead of time about what they owe on the property, any assessments they know that are coming up, and any liens they have against the property. Taxes is a big one. Aloha, that's definitely a big one. If there are tenants in the property, if the property is, say it's a twin and both sides are being sold, or it's a duplex and it's occupied by tenants and those tenants have an agreement to, they're in the middle of their lease. Well, they can't be kicked out when the new owner buys the house. That lease still applies. So we have to know what's going on with that tenancy. And that's where this section comes into play. What you've done ahead of this is you've asked for a copy of the lease. You've had a conversation, there's been conversation about, are they month to month? How long are they staying? Do they want to stay if they're month to month? What are they paying now? All those conversations have happened, but you need to make sure that it's documented here clearly in the contract. If it's not applicable, then you mark not applicable. If it is applicable, then this next section gets filled out. Lead-based paint, becoming one of my favorite things right now. If a house was built in 1980, there is no reason a buyer needs to sign a lead-based paint disclosure just because the listing agent had the seller fill it out. It does not apply. And I'm seeing it all the time. I'm seeing it on houses built in the 2000s. Oh, here's a lead-based paint disclosure. What are you disclosing? The house was built after 1978. The contract is very clear. It is only applicable to dwellings built prior to 1978. If the house was not built before 1978, the seller shouldn't have filled out a lead-based paint disclosure. There's nothing to disclose. However, if it was built before 1978, by federal law, we have to have a lead-based paint disclosure. It is pretty rare in if you're on the call and you're in Philly, you guys probably have more lead-based paint issues come up than we do on this side of the water. We do see it in, again, older homes, Haddonfield, downtown Morristown a lot. I see it in Mount Holly. Sometimes I see it in Burlington City. It just depends on how old the municipality is and how old the houses are and the condition of the houses, but very rarely does someone have lead-based paint testing done. However, they have to be made aware that there could be lead-based paint in the house and that they have the right to have the property tested. So even though this is in the contract and you're saying it's applicable and everybody is signing the contract, you still must have a lead-based paint disclosure in addition to this statement here. So if this is marked applicable, you expect to see the addendum with it. This goes into if they have the lead-based paint inspection done, what that time period looks like. I get asked a lot, why is this section even in the contract? In our area, we don't see this a lot. However, there are still properties in Cherry Hill that have cesspools. Generally, we see it down further in Vineland, Cumberland County, Franklin County. We don't see it as much up here. Mount Laurel. If there's a cesspool, it needs to be cleaned up. But generally, you're going to have a not applicable here. And you're going to skip this whole page. Then we get into the home inspection period, whose type of home inspection that they can have, who's responsible for the home inspection, parameters for radon. That's pretty important. Who's responsible for curing radon, wood boring insect inspection. This date here, again, if you leave it blank, it's 14 calendar days, which matches with the buyer's right to a home inspection further down here, 14 calendar days. This can be shortened and it can be extended. If it is, then you have to fill in the time frame in this window. And a lot of buyers now are shortening the home inspection period if they can to make it more appealing to a seller. It's just hard to get the home inspectors in there in that period of time. This section is very clear in regards to timing, but it is not very clear on, and where we get hung up is, well, the buyer has a home inspection and they don't want the house, they can just walk away. They actually cannot just walk away. And that is made very clear in this section D, the buyer's right to inspection. In 14 calendar days after the attorney review period, the buyer or their attorney is to provide to the seller's attorney or the seller's agent and the sellers within that 14 calendar day window any request for repair and information in written reports that apply to that request for repair. If the buyer doesn't send anything in that 14 calendar day section, this contingency clause shall be deemed waived by the buyer, and the party shall be deemed acceptable, and the property shall be deemed acceptable by the buyer. I just closed on a transaction a few weeks ago where the buyer's agent sent to me 3 days after the inspection period ended a request for a $2,800 credit on an as-is property. Now, separate conversation, as is isn't always as is. but he came to me 3 days after the inspection period. Now, the buyer was gracious enough to say, I'll give him $500. The seller didn't have to say, I'll give him anything, but sorry, the seller said they'll give him $500. And the buyer's agent was like, can't we really work on this? Well, the buyer's agent messed up because the buyer's agent wasn't tracking the dates properly. So guess who had to give the buyer some money? The buyer's agent.
Buyer's agent.
Correct. Because they didn't count the days properly. And if you work with me on a transaction, not only am I following dates, but my transaction coordinator is following the dates, and she very clearly lets everybody know what the dates are. It's not something that's easy to miss. You're probably told 3 times what the dates are. Very, very important that you, whether you have the seller or the buyer, document your dates somewhere on a calendar or somewhere where you can plainly and clearly see them. Because if you miss this date, this really affects the buyer. The seller, so you got this 14-day window, responsibility to cure. So the buyer asks for their request for repairs. It goes to the seller. The seller then has 7 business days after they receive everything to notify the buyer in writing what they will correct or cure of any of the defects set forth in such report. There can be argument over what's a defect. The seller may not agree with what the buyer is asking for as necessarily a defect. The seller may come back and say they're not going to fix anything. The buyer has then 7 more business days to decide how they want to proceed. They do not have to proceed at this point. If the seller says they're fixing everything, win-win. And the buyer just says, okay. Otherwise, the buyer has now got a problem with this section, which is where my buyer a few years ago ran into a problem. If the seller says they're going to fix, I don't know, 4 or 5 things, the buyer then needs to decide, is that 5th thing really important enough? Will they take it on themselves? Do they care that much about that one thing? Is it going to make or break them buying the house? And if not, they can agree, and then we're done with the home inspection period. Flood hazard. Hopefully, if you represent the buyer, you have checked the property records to see if this is in a flood zone. Title is going to check, and so is the mortgage lender. You're going to see that the buyer gets information. Well, you might not see it, but the buyer is going to get notice from their lender that says you're not in a flood zone. If they are in a flood zone, there's additional insurance required. That additional insurance required can impact a buyer negatively. If they're getting a mortgage, that additional insurance is not optional. Flood insurance must be part of their homeowner's insurance. So once they've signed the contract, within 10 calendar days after the attorney review period is completed, they can still disprove the contract if we find out it's in a flood zone. But generally, you've probably known before. If you know before and you've come to an agreement with a seller and you have the buyer, ask the seller's agent for information about the buyer's flood insurance policy. Again, if the seller owns the house outright, they may not have flood insurance. It's only required if you have a mortgage. Another piece with that is if your buyer is cash, they don't have to get homeowners insurance unless they want to. Those 2 pieces are only required if you have a mortgage. Qualifications of inspectors. Your buyer's dad's Uncle Bob's son Tommy's friend Bob cannot come do the home inspection just because he's a licensed contractor in the state of Delaware. It has to be a licensed home inspector in the state of New Jersey. That's what qualifies them as a home inspector. You will have a lot of buyers, if they have parents or friends out of state, New York mostly. New York's home inspectors are generally licensed engineers and they have an engineering inspection. There are 4 licensed home inspectors in the state of New Jersey who are also licensed engineers. Therefore, it is very rare that someone who is a licensed engineer or has an engineering background is inspecting the property. Just a little sidebar note. So you have to be a licensed home inspector, and the seller does not have to let them in if they are not a licensed home inspector, and you'll know when you go to set it up. Megan's Law, they can go find out on their own. You have no comment about Megan's Law. Because the contract tells you that. It's one of those things you can be like, whoop, sorry, can't say anything. Off-site conditions. If the seller knows that there's a Superfund site in their backyard, they need to let your buyer know. Does that make sense? Because that could negatively affect the property. If they know that an airport is getting ready to, the farmland behind them is being sold and the airport's coming in, they should probably let you know. Airport safety zone notice. This is plainly listed in here. Seller does not have to tell you. It's right here. Bulk sales. We just had an attorney class on bulk sales. Kind of tricky. Doesn't apply most of the time. If you're not sure whether or not it applies, fill out the bulk sales form. Doesn't cost any money to fill it out. If you don't fill it out, though, it could come back and bite your buyer later. So just read section 21. And if you have more questions about that, we can get you the link to the bulk sales attorney class we just had. Oh, here's the piece about insurance. So even though title's going to ask if they got insurance, the lender's going to remind them to get insurance. You're going to say, don't forget your homeowner's insurance. Contract tells them the same thing. So it's kind of hard for them to not get insurance. They're reminded so many times. Maintenance and condition of the property. This is kind of important because when a seller is selling the appliances as is, or they note things are as is, they have to be working. So if it's working when you come through the house, it can't be broken at your final walkthrough. So if the dishwasher is being sold as is, and it works when you do your home inspection, still needs to work at settlement. Because the seller agrees to maintain everything up to ordinary wear and tear. So if they're still living in the property, they're still using it. A seller does not have to have a house professionally cleaned before settlement for the buyer to move in. They don't even have to mop the floors. They don't even have to clean the toilets. They just have to broom clean and make it free of debris. They can't leave trash laying around. And I have gone to closing before where the HVAC is not working, and that's always a fun thing to deal with. You do want to do, and this is kind of why you most importantly want to do a walkthrough just before settlement or the day of settlement instead of 3 days before settlement. If you do the final walkthrough 3 days before settlement and the hot water heater busts, your buyer's going to buy the house and walk back through the house after they've bought the house and there's water all over the place. Well, you didn't walk through the day before the day of settlement. You didn't walk through right before settlement. Anything can happen in that window. So try to do your walkthroughs the day of settlement to make sure that the property has been maintained. The risk of loss and damage of the property is on the owner of the property, not the buyer. So we had an agent in our Cherry Hill office who last year had buyers purchasing a property, and they went to do the walkthrough 2 hours before settlement, and a tree had fallen, damaged the roof in the front of the house. So that's kind of a problem, right? Like, who's fixing it? The buyer doesn't own the property yet. The seller hasn't sold the property yet. So technically it's on the seller, right? Except that seller had canceled their homeowner's insurance for the day before settlement. So the seller then had no homeowner's insurance on the property. So the seller blamed the buyer's agent for damage that happened to their house, which was a force majeure, was an act of God. No one could control it, and the property could not be sold. So now you have a seller who's no longer living in a house, who's furious with the buyer's agent because they made a mistake, and they're furious with their agent, and a buyer who has no place to live and all their belongings are on a truck. So the lesson there is make sure your sellers don't cancel their homeowner's insurance until after settlement.
Wow, that's crazy.
It was crazy. It took months to work out too. And the agent in our office that represented the buyer was like, what should I have done differently? And there was nothing they could have done differently. It was literally a storm. Nobody saw it coming. Initial and final walkthroughs. We used to just have one walkthrough, but the way the contract is written now, and because we can't exchange cash at the table, Tammy probably remembers days where you'd go to settlement and something would have happened at the walkthrough and somebody's ponying up $300 or $700.
Yep.
Can't do that anymore. So that's why we have the initial walkthrough. If there are repairs being made to the property by the seller, it's great to go through and check those out ahead of time, especially if the seller's not giving you any receipts. If the seller's giving you receipts and it's by someone who's licensed, okay, you're pretty good. But you have the option to do 2 walkthroughs. But again, that final walkthrough should be at a reasonable time before closing, once the seller is not coming back in the house. Another thing that can happen here is sometimes the seller will get excited about their selling the property and they'll call and say, we need to have the utilities shut off on this day. And then you go to do your walkthrough and the water's not on and there's no electricity. Well, the water needs to be running to do your walkthrough, because what if a pipe burst? So we want the sellers to say they're selling the property and that the buyer will be calling to set the utilities up in their name, and the property settles on April 2nd. So they're not turning it off. They're just saying, hey, we're going to sell the property and a buyer's calling. So we don't want it shut off. So utilities need to be on, and you need to do that walkthrough as close to settlement time as possible. Otherwise, you can't negotiate things that aren't fixed, because negotiating them at the table is never a good idea. Adjustments at closing. This goes into why we can't negotiate things at the table. So the buyer has been given a closing disclosure 3 business days before closing. That's where it ends with money being given. It's gone through underwriting. The underwriter's done their review. Numbers and monies can't change. I just had a buyer who thought that they had an agreement and an arrangement with an attorney, and the attorney wasn't going to send an invoice. Well, guess who sent an invoice? And it showed up on the CD. Well, she went and got her check thinking she knew what the number was. And she got her check 5 days before closing, which is really a little bit early, but she was very excited. And then she's like, well, now what do I do? I mean, I have the money, but my check doesn't match. Well, she just had to go get a second check. But we can't have any changes once that CD is made, because initially she was like, we'll just have the attorney take that fee off, then I'll just give him a check, which would normally be okay, except the CD had already been approved. All the numbers were approved, mortgage package is ready to go, no changes can be made. So if you don't do that initial walkthrough and see that the work is done properly, then you don't have an opportunity for the seller to give the buyer a credit for work they may not have had done properly. Does that make sense? Other things here is the seller has to take care of things they have to pay for. If there are any judgments or liens against the property, that has to be taken care of ahead of time, or it has to be paid for at the time of closing. The seller's mortgage is paid off at closing. All these pieces are noted in here. Real estate taxes, insurance premiums, all those pieces are taken care of at closing and listed on the sheet. But we don't make any adjustments at the closing table. It's all done ahead of time because, well, that's just how the Dodd-Frank Act works. Failure of the buyer or seller to close. This paragraph will almost always be stricken by an attorney because, well, it says that the agents have to be paid if it doesn't close, so they strike this. Consumer information statement. This piece of the contract with the broker's information and who's who and all of their license number information, this information is in here. So the buyer or the seller can report you or the brokerage to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and tell them how terrible you are, and then they can fine you. That's actually why that is added. It's full disclosure of who the parties are and what their license numbers are. Your buyer, when they get their loan estimate and their closing disclosure, will see on the paperwork that it says at the bottom, if you have any problems or complaints, please call us. They don't want to know when things are going well. They want to know when things are going bad so they can go make some money. It's kind of not very fair. Let's see here. Commissions cannot be a lien. This is important disclosure that a buyer or a seller is a real estate licensee. It just needs to be made known up front that someone involved is a licensed real estate agent. We have to disclose that in the listing. So if in the listing it's marked that they're related to, or they are, or they have financial interest, this section needs to be made known. Section 33 is for the lenders mostly, stating that the buyers and the sellers agree that the closing disclosure documents and any amendments need to be made known and given to. So this way your buyer and your seller's attorney can review the documents ahead of closing. Really. Professional referrals, this keeps you off the hook, but it doesn't make people not mad at you. If you refer a contractor to somebody or you refer a home inspector, you can't be held liable if that person is terrible at their job or they're late. Any names you provide are a recommendation or a testimony of competency of that person, but you can't be held liable for their performance. Attorney review clause. I always feel like this should be further up in the contract because it happens before everything else happens. But this lets everybody know how the disapproval of a contract works, how the counting of the days works. Most specifically, if I have buyers and the seller signs a contract and I get it back right now, attorney review doesn't begin right now. Attorney review begins once I give the buyers the contract. They say they got the contract and the next day. So if all that happened today by 3 o'clock, attorney review doesn't begin at 3 o'clock. We don't count today as day one. Day one is tomorrow. Business days and holidays do not count. Black Friday is not a holiday. Christmas Eve is not a holiday. New Year's Eve is not a holiday. I get asked those three a lot, so I just thought I'd throw them out there. Notices. This used to say we could do, it does say, it used to say telegraph on here, that you could send notices by telegraph. That changed a few years ago because nobody communicates that way anymore, right? So this says you can communicate by fax, email, overnight courier, electronic documentation. So any of these notices can be sent, and most everything is done by email. And this is stating that everyone agrees that that's how we can send communications back and forth. Section 37 is important for the seller and the buyer, but the buyer needs to understand that they can't in the middle of the contract decide that their brother is going to buy the property for them because they changed their job. The contract is between the seller and the buyer and that buyer. If they want to add somebody or they need a co-signer, the seller has to agree or the contract is void. Does that make sense? Electronic signing. Everybody can electronically sign now. Doesn't really apply most of the time. In this entire agreement, the parties that are liable are the ones that are in the contract. It's binding to all parties who sign it. And the contract is between the seller and the buyer. So applicable laws, what applies in New Jersey, not what applies in other states. If you have any of these addenda that need to be included, say there's a swimming pool or there's a seller's concession, or everybody wants the coronavirus one added now, FHA or VA loan. Again, lead-based paint disclosure, very clear, pre-1978. Any of these addenda that are going to be part of the transaction need to be marked in this section. Part of that is for the appraiser and part of that is for title and the lenders, but we need to note what it is. Now, this stuff down here, you can ignore all of this, but this is where you would add additional provisions into the contract. Additional things like the buyer agrees to pay up to $5,000 above the appraised value if the home under appraises, or attorneys love it when we write this in, that the property is being sold in as is condition. They love that. Anything we put in that contractual provisions can be seen as practicing law. So we have to be very careful how we word that. But we also don't want to leave it blank if some of those terms have been agreed upon with another party. So that's kind of the overview nuts and bolts of the contract and how you're really just filling in blanks, essentially. We don't want to strike through things. Like if the contract is as is, don't strike through all of section 16 because an attorney's their head's going to explode. You just write it in the additional contract provisions. Anybody have any questions? Okay, yeah, we're a pretty quiet group today. And we'll do this class again next month. Cabrina will do this class last Wednesday of April. And then we will have an attorney come back, a real estate attorney come back and do this class again for us in May. But if you guys come up with any questions.
Julie.
Yeah.
You are awesome. This was a great class.
Well, thank you for coming. I didn't even see you there.
So there was a question, what if people are related in a contract and they do not make it known? So I know this is something we normally go over more in detail in the short sale class, but do you have some insight on that? Because that was one of the questions that I seen on here.
If parties, so if the seller's related to the buyer and it's not an arm's length transaction,
Yeah, and they do not make it known.
oh, they need to make it known because the lender's going to ask. That's where they're going to get hung. They're going to get hung with the lender.
Do we use the word mortgage fraud in that sentence?
Okay, I would like to say yes, but I am warned very often to be careful how I use the word fraud. How about they're big fat liars?
Okay, we'll go with that. We'll go with that.
I mean, it'll get found out on title. They're going to catch it.
Oh, I'm sorry. The question is if they are,
Is it in the chat?
yeah, if they are a realtor and they do not make it known. Now that's a big no-no.
That's
Ooh.
a no-no.
Yes.
No.
Yes. So, and then
They're a realtor, if they're related to the seller, if they're related to the buyer, not needed as much as if they're related to the seller or they are the seller.
if they are the seller, I think the language is clear.
Yep.
I know in
Very clear.
Pennsylvania and Delaware, both contracts, there is a box you have to check off. If you have financial interest in the property, you have to check that off. Meaning if you're the owner, you're on title, so on and so forth, you have to make that known. It's not a fair, and you just got to look at it like it's not a fair transaction. If I come to the fight with a gun and you only have a pencil,
Right.
it's not going to be a fair fight. So that's why you need to make it known that you have financial interest and you are a realtor, and I'm not just going to say realtor because realtor is only if you belong to the association. If you are a real estate professional.
That's it.
So if you are a realtor.
You could have your license in referral and it still applies to you.
Yeah.
You could have another, now when I was at Berkshire, you were not allowed to list your own properties. And not all brokerages are that way, because like here at Keller Williams, you can list your own property. It's just kind of sketchy and hairy when you do. So like I'm getting ready to list an investment property I have. I'll note that I have a financial interest because I am a part owner in the property with my husband. However, an attorney is handling all of it, like all of it.
Well, if you need a real estate agent, I am licensed in New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, just in case, just throwing it out there.
I'm thinking I probably should have had a real estate agent represent my husband when we bought our house, but
I agree. But again, I just want to say this was a wonderful class, and I also wanted to put in my shameless plug. Please join us on Thursday, April 15th at 7 p.m. via Zoom. You'll also hear this again at the sales meeting for our DEI meeting. There's a lot of friendly faces that I see, or I'll say friendly pictures that I see on the Zoom call. I would love to see your friendly pictures and friendly faces on the Zoom call for DEI. And those of you who do not know what DEI is, diversity, inclusion, oh goodness, this is terrible. Diversity, equity, and inclusion task force. But back to this contract class. Sorry, I didn't mean to be a disruption.
no, that's perfectly fine. It was not a distraction. Yeah, we do this every month, but if something comes up along the way and you have questions, certainly let me know. Especially if you're a PA agent and this all seems like chaos for you. We do invite our PA agents from across the water to join and be in part of this class every month. So again, last Wednesday of every month at 12, we have this class, and Cabrina and I both teach it a little differently. And then when there's an attorney on, I always pick up something when the attorney's on. So we're going to do an attorney once a quarter for this class. Okay. I hope you guys have an amazing Wednesday, and I hope everyone sells a house this week.
Thank you, Julie.
All righty. You guys enjoy your day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.